alternative energy. And then what our report attempts to do is again, to demonstrate that there's a cost associated with these methods of production. And those costs are communities organizing against those actions, and holding the company to account, financially to account, in the case of lawsuits, in the case of organized boycotts, in the case of demanding that the company spend its money not on its image, but on actually cleaning up its act and its practices.
You begin this alternative annual report by looking at some of the people involved with lobbying on Chevron's behalf and some of the leadership within Chevron that directly relates to some people who are in the news today. Can you go through some of who these figures are, beginning with William J. Haynes?
I'd say William Haynes is particularly important. He was the chief counsel, the chief civilian counsel at the Pentagon under the Bush administration, now hired in 2008 to become chief counsel for Chevron. Haynes is currently being investigated both by the U.S. Senate and a Spanish court that may launch criminal charges against him for his involvement in the so-called torture memos that Haynes personally wrote or oversaw the decision to use harsh techniques on prisoners in Guantanamo and in Iraq. There was a letter, actually, when Haynes was being considered by the Bush administration for a judgeship from 20 U.S. military leaders against that appointment, saying that in those memos, Haynes actually advocated the use of dogs to intimidate suspects. The appointment of Haynes as the chief counsel at Chevron, given that Chevron is facing these mass human rights abuse challenges in Burma, in Nigeria, the environmental degradation and human rights consequences of that, in Ecuador, also public health challenges in the Philippines and in Kazakhstan, is quite daunting and quite disturbing for those who are involved in those cases to see, what type of justice is that Chevron is bringing to the fore. And there has been many calls to demand that Haynes be fired from Chevron and not be given that position while he's under investigation for those memos. Another interesting former Chevron board member who was on Chevron's board prior to his appointment into the Obama administration is General James Jones, who not only is now the head of the NSC, but while he was on Chevron's board, had also spent 2 years as the head of the Chamber of Commerce 21st Century Energy Program. And that was the Chamber of Commerce, essentially the largest business lobby group in the country's efforts to directly challenge legislation to address climate change and to aggressively advocate the agenda of the oil industry for lifting the moratoriums on offshore drilling, for increased shale development, and other domestic efforts for the oil industry, but also to try and link more directly U.S. foreign policy with our energy policy. And he's now, as I said, the head of the Obama administration's National Security Council. Those are just two key examples.
You also talk about lobbyist J. Stephen Growls.
And I'm afraid I've lost the sound in my feed.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me now?
And so can't hear if you're talking to me.
Maybe we can get a cell phone up to your ear. We're going to try to get a cell phone up to your ear.
I can hear you now, Amy.
You can hear me now. You also refer to
Yes,
J.
I can.
Stephen Growls, current convict. You write as a headline, ex-Chevron lobbyist.
Yeah, Stephen Growls was this #2 at the Interior Department under the Bush administration. His tenure at Interior was described by the Inspector General who investigated him as, quote, an ethical quagmire. He was probably the best example of an individual who was, while in office in the Bush administration, doing everything he could on behalf of his former oil industry clients. Griles became very much embroiled within the Jack Abramoff scandal, is now imprisoned for his role in that scandal. And he was, in at least two instances, worked for Chevron, one lobbying on behalf of Chevron's merger with Texaco, and in another as a witness within a very significant case of Chevron and other companies being charged with and then settling those charges of essentially not paying up on the dues that they owed to states and the federal government for offshore drilling. Now, all these offshore drilling crimes, that one included and many others that we describe within the report, are very important for the public to understand as Chevron in the oil industry right now tries to lobby to say how clean and safe and good for the economy offshore drilling could be. We have that instance of them not paying their dues. The other instance we have is in Alaska, where there's a current lawsuit against Chevron for dumping mass amounts of toxins and other pollutants into Alaska's Cook Inlet as part of its ongoing offshore drilling operations there. Again, another lawsuit challenging Chevron's operations and potentially its bottom line.
I want to turn now to Ecuador. In a moment, we're going to be joined by the media advisor for Latin America for Chevron, James Craig. But from your perspective, Antonia Juhasz, can you lay out what the issue is with Chevron in Ecuador?
Well, this is there's two instances. There's two examples to focus on here. One is the extremity of the case, which is for the 30 years that Texaco operated in Ecuador, its blatant and chosen disregard for environmental laws and environmental standards that created what's called a Chernobyl in the Amazon, of a massive oil dumping oil spill that continues to pollute, cause mass health problems, cancer, miscarriages, and has destroyed essentially the Amazonian jungle in Ecuador. And Texaco, which was then purchased by Chevron's unwillingness to come clean and clean up its mess and pay for the damages and the health effects and the livelihood effects of the community. That judgment has now, as we've said, come up to potentially a $27 billion judgment. But this is also the story of long-term successful organizing by the Ecuadorians, supported by Americans, supported by a global movement to ensure that this case, which was initially launched in 1993 in the United States, then moved to Ecuador, would continue to receive support and attention and be heard and continue to be fought. Because as we see all around the world, the case in Ecuador is not isolated, and that each of these communities is following a similar model, organizing, sustaining that organizing in the local community, needing support here, needing a voice here to see that they too can carry their case all the way through against this enormous financial behemoth, which is Chevron. And now it does look like, even though Chevron has consistently misled its own shareholders on this point, that the Ecuadorian judge is going to rule as early as this fall against Chevron and require a $27 billion cleanup.
We're talking to Antonia Juhasz, who's issued an alternative report called The True Cost of Chevron ahead of Wednesday's Chevron shareholder meeting. We're going to turn now to James Craig, media advisor for Latin America for Chevron. He doesn't want to debate Antonia, but wants to lay out Chevron's case. Welcome to Democracy Now!, James Craig. I wanted to get your response to the New York Attorney General Andrew Cuomo opening an investigation of Chevron to determine if it is misleading shareholders about the financial risks the company faces in Ecuador.
Well, thanks, first of all, for having me on the program. And, you know, I guess in response to that, the issue of Andrew Cuomo, I could say that, you know, the company is in the process of responding to his letter. Unfortunately, it seems Mr. Cuomo was misled by a group of U.S. trial lawyers. But first, let me discuss really what our position is with regard to the court case in Ecuador, if that's okay.
Yes, but just that issue of how you think that Andrew Cuomo was misled when it comes to Chevron revealing to its shareholders the risk that it faces in Ecuador, the financial risk because of this case being brought against Ecuador, Chevron for its environmental practices in Ecuador.
Well, Chevron has disclosed for years in its annual reports and in its filings with the SEC exactly its position on the case in Ecuador. It's not, the case in Ecuador is not a secret to anyone. It's widely debated and discussed in the public sphere. The shareholders are aware of it. They've been made aware of it. The SEC's been made aware of it. So, I mean, there is no issue here with regard to the company not disclosing anything. The judicial proceedings in Ecuador, just so as you understand, is a farce.